Thank you very much for joining us today and warmly welcome to this webinar on carbon dioxide use and removal. I am Oras Tynkkynen from Tyrsky Consulting, and I have the pleasure of moderating this discussion today. I see that there are people trickling in every minute, so I'll just say a couple of things to start with while people are joining us, and before we get properly started and dive into today's interesting topic. Starting with some very practical housekeeping notes, please use the Q&A for posing your questions throughout the webinar to any of the speakers. You should find it here in Zoom. I think it on your side would be at the bottom. Q&A, it says, and there are two speech bubbles, so please do pose your questions there. And the chat function you can also make use of if you want to share your questions or comments, well, perhaps not questions, that would be better equipped for the Q&A box, but for comments and reflections, if you want to share any links to material and for purposes like that. By joining this webinar today, you will grant us the permission to record the webinar, and I think it will benefit all of us because we will be sharing the webinar recording after this event today. We will also be saving the chat and submitted questions, but only for research purposes, and nothing you write there will be attributed to individual people. So I hope you feel free to share your views are uninhibited. If you're on Twitter and want to share something you have learned in this webinar or other social media platforms, please use the hashtag #CCUS. It's a bit generic, I know, but it's also short and sweet, so let's go with that this time. And if you happen to face any technical issues, and of course, let's hope there aren't any, do reach out to Helena Määttä in the Zoom chat, and she will do her very best to try to help you if that happens. Now, we have a very interesting program today with excellent speakers, so I'm not going to steal much time from them. I would just like to perhaps note that carbon dioxide use and removal is very much a hot topic today, much discussed in Europe and elsewhere. It's also sometimes perhaps a bit controversial topic. And what we are trying to do today in this webinar is hopefully serve all of you with slightly different types of information. If you are a newcomer to this rapidly evolving space, perhaps you can take away from today's discussions an overview of the technologies and the markets and the policies regarding different solutions on carbon dioxide use and removal. If you are, on the other hand, a seasoned veteran, then hopefully we can try to provide you with some updates to your already existing knowledge. Just one observation about the terminology. You may have noticed that we have decided to use carbon dioxide use and removal for the purposes of this webinar. However, there are plenty of options to choose from. It's an evolving field, and often what comes with that is that there are different terms used for slightly different concepts and slightly different definitions. You might hear from CCUS, like I mentioned earlier, carbon capture, use and storage, or carbon dioxide removal, CDR, perhaps negative emissions technologies, NETs, or natural and technical sinks. We are not here to solve the terminological debate here today, so we invite all of you to join the discussion with your favorite terms. And let's focus on the interesting solutions that these different terms try to capture. Now, let's get on with the program. First, we have welcoming words that will be delivered by Lotta Heikkonen, who is a chief specialist at the Finnish Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry. And Lotta, you do have the floor. I hope that you are able to speak.
Yes, thank you, Oras. and thank you for the guiding words. I'm a bit of a newbie to this team myself, so I'm really excited about the program today. And thank you also for Tyrsky Consulting for organizing this webinar. Welcome all to our afternoon full of knowledge. I can see that the participant count has hit over 100 people, so I'm really excited to welcome you all here today. This webinar is part of a multidisciplinary research project which is funded by the Finnish government's analysis, assessment and research activities. This project will help us in the government with important knowledge for decision making. The CURPP project steering group members represent 3 different ministries in Finland: agriculture and forestry, that's me. Then there's Ministry of Environment, and the leading role has been given to the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment of Finland. Carbon removal is a cross-cutting theme, and it's becoming increasingly more important. The focus of this CURPP project is on the technological solutions for carbon removal. There is already a big buzz around different carbon removal technologies, and I wouldn't be surprised to see a huge technological leaps in the future. However, all of this development needs a policy framework to function, accelerate, and produce real climate impacts. Together with my expert colleagues in the Ministry of Environment, we have also commissioned various studies related to the voluntary compensation in collaboration with other ministries. They are a good complement to this study, and we are soon to expect a very interesting publication addressing the carbon removal projects and voluntary compensation. The CURPP project, the theme for today, improves knowledge on the technologies, markets, regulation, and policies on carbon dioxide capture, utilization, and storage, as well as technical things. The project is also analyzing the policies and measures required in Finland to introduce these solutions and to support Finland in developing position for EU energy and climate legislation. Today, our guest speaker, Oliver Jäden, will introduce the current state and potential of carbon dioxide removal technologies. The CDR solutions can mean growth opportunities for various types of technologies and industries. For example, production of construction materials, chemicals, fuels, and other industrial processes are part of today's discussion. The carbon dioxide use and removal markets and technologies used are also highly dependent on the legislative setting. We are happy to invite our second guest speaker, Christian Holzleitner from the European Commission, to discuss the policy framework of carbon dioxide use and removal. Both of our guest speakers will be supported with the experts from Technical Research Center of Finland and Finnish Environment Institute, who are also part of the CURPP project participants. My hope for us participants today is to actively share our thoughts on the national, European, and global policy frameworks, which are in place or should be in place in the future. So I'm hoping everyone will enjoy the webinar and once again be active. Thank you.
Thank you, Lotta, very much for setting the scene and introducing the project. And I very much echo your invitation for all of our participants today to join actively in the discussions. We will now move straight away to the first presentation, which is given to us by Lauri Kujanka from the aforementioned Technical Research Center of Finland. Lauri works there as a research team leader, and he can build on what Lotta just said about the project and tell a bit about what we are up to. Lauri, you have the floor.
Thank you. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lauri Kujampa. I'm a research team leader at the Technical Research Center of Finland. And I will now give you a brief introduction to the research project, carbon dioxide use and removal, prospects and policies. It's a one-year project. We are in the middle of it. So today, the event that we are in is organized by the project, and this is the first public midterm event of the project. As Lotta already mentioned, the project is funded under the government's analysis, assessment and research activities, and our main goal is to increase the knowledge on the technologies and markets and policies around carbon capture, use and storage and carbon dioxide removal. And we do emphasize and focus the carbon dioxide removals, or in other words, technologies that enable negative emissions. We have two events planned in the project for outreach and engagement. This midterm event is the first one, and then we will have a final results seminar in the beginning of next year, so in March 2023. I'm pleased to introduce and revisit the partners in the project. First of all, VTT Technical Research Center of Finland is coordinating the process. Then we have the Finnish Environment Institute and Tyrsky Consulting as the two other partners, research partners in the project. VTT is taking as on our responsibility the technology and market overview in the project, and the Finnish Environment Institute together with Tyrsky Consulting has the responsibility over the policy review in the project. Tyrsky Consulting furthermore is responsible for the communications and engagement activities in the project. And I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge how the group of people that we have in the project. I'm very pleased to work with the people and the level of expertise that we have in the project group. The steering group for the project, as mentioned, is formed by three Finnish ministries: the Ministry of Economic Affairs and the Employment, Ministry of the Environment, and the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry of Finland. And the steering group has been very interested and active with the project, and I appreciate the guidance that we have obtained from the steering group so far during the project. Now, I will not take your attention too deeply into the contents of the project, but just as a quick one-slide summary about the contents in the project, we have separate work packages for assessing the technologies, the markets, and the policy environment of the carbon dioxide use and removal. The fourth work package is dedicated for the communications and engagement and integration of stakeholder and expert input into the project. The technology, market and policy review work so far during the first half of the project has been focused on the state of the art, the current state of affairs, and then during the second half of the project, during the now upcoming final stage of the project, we will focus more on the future foreseeable developments around carbon dioxide use and removal. The technology work package will focus, for instance, on the realistic biogenic sink potential in Finland, technological sink potential in Finland. And the market review work package will have a look at the main export potential for Finland, taking into account the industrial setting that we have here. The policy and framework work package will continue following what's happening in the policy field, in the energy and climate policy field, but also we will assess what kind of needs for developments there are in the regulations and the policy around carbon dioxide use and removal. We will also broaden and focus on the international benchmarking activities during the second half of the project. Then I would also like to present what our main motivations for today's event are. First of all, we are about, during the following days, to publish the midterm report of the project, which will include the preliminary draft findings of the project so far. And for this reason, we want to invite your feedback on some of the main results that we will present to you today. But most of all, today's event is an opportunity for all of us to engage in discussion and dialogue around the theme, about the matter of carbon dioxide removals with the broader audience. For instance, we hope that today we all will learn something new about what might be the most promising carbon dioxide use and removal solutions in the future, and how will the markets evolve or are likely to evolve. What is the role of current policies, or how should the current policies be shaped to enable the technologies and avoid any pitfalls that are related to the technologies, for instance, taking care of the permanence of the carbon removals. Also, we want to focus on the best practices on national and international level. Are there good policy practices that we can learn from? These are some of the preliminary thoughts for today, and the presenters today will discuss more in detail about the topics. For my part, I wish you will all enjoy today's event, and if you have any further questions about the project, you may visit the link that is on the slide to access more information about the project, but you can also contact me directly. I am pleased to answer any of your questions. Thank you for my part for now.
Thank you, Ulri. I trust that all of you now have a bit better understanding of what the project is all about. And do remember, don't be a stranger, like Lauri suggested. Feel free to reach out to Lauri or any of us after this event if you want to learn more or work together. Now, next we have the great privilege and pleasure to welcome Dr. Oliver Geeden, who is a man of many trades, but also a lead author for the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, and has an affiliation, among others, at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. I'm sure all of you have been intensely reading the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, and one of the exciting and interesting features there was indeed its focus on carbon dioxide removal. And now we are happy to learn more about that from Dr. Geeden. Dr. Geeden, please, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to this interesting webinar. I think it's really important that we have these conversations across the European Union. I myself, I'm a specialist on EU CDR policy, but also German climate and CDR policy specifically. And there are similar projects in Germany happening as well. But today, as you can see here, I'm exclusively wearing my IPCC hat and will give you an overview about the approach taken by the IPCC's Sixth Assessment Report, of which I was part of, regarding the Working Group 3 report that was published in April, and still am being part of concerning the synthesis report of all working group reports that will be published next year in March. Let me get to it. Unfortunately, my slides are not moving. That's unfortunate. Here we are. So let's start with a definition of carbon dioxide removal taken by all the IPCC reports. There's a common glossary, and I underlined some of the important elements. It's defined as anthropogenic activities removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and durably storing it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in products. But it excludes, as you can see in the last sentence, natural CO2 uptake not directly caused by human activities. So the anthropogenic is important, CO2 from the atmosphere is important, so CCS on fossil fuels would not count as carbon dioxide removal. And durably storing is important, although durably storing is a little bit ambiguous and would have to be further defined in the future. Now, for many policymakers, it's sometimes quite incomprehensible what is in the full report. And as you know, at the end of a cycle for a single report, you have what we call an approval plenary with government delegations on the summary for policymakers that serves to create some kind of co-ownership. The summary is not allowed to contradict what's in the report, and that's not going to be changed. But these, let's say, negotiations are quite interesting in itself, and it also defines how these issues are further debated. While there is no carbon dioxide removal chapter in the Working Group 3 report, there is a section, C11. You can see the full text on the right side of the slide. But again, I will only read the first part of the bold statement, and I think that already defines how the debate is evolving now. The deployment of carbon dioxide removal to counterbalance hard-to-abate residual emissions is unavoidable if net zero CO2 or GHG emissions are to be achieved. In plain language, and you often struggle to get plain language into the diplomatic negotiated documents, is if you already have set a net zero target in your country, you implicitly already said yes to carbon dioxide removal, because otherwise it would simply have been a zero emissions target, not a net zero emissions target. And I think that while experts knew that all around, and many people in government and policymakers in parliament might have known something about it, it helps to acknowledge that we now need to get serious, or at least the countries that have a net zero target, in defining that CDR part, both in volumes and types of CDR methods being used and how to incentivize them. A quick overview on the report. As I said, there are no specific CDR chapters in the Working Group Reports 1 and 3. Working Group 1 on the physical climate science has been published last year in August already, but there are chapters where you find a lot of it. Chapter 4 and 5 in Working Group 1, chapters 12, 7, and 3 in Working Group 3. 12 is cross-sectoral perspectives, where I was located. 7 is the AFOLU chapter, agriculture, forestry, other land use. 3 is the scenarios chapter. You will all find these chapters online, some of which not already typeset. I think there is a terminology-wise an important differentiation between the outcome of practices and the result on the systems level. So the IPCC now avoids the term negative emissions, because quite often there is some confusion with net negative emissions, which is on the systems level. So if you need negative emissions already to achieve net zero, that confuses many people. So we would simply call it carbon dioxide removal to describe the practice, which can then lead on a systems level to net negative emissions if there is more CDR than residual emissions. We completely avoid what's quite popular in the political debate, that terminology and that dichotomy of nature-based or natural CDR versus technological CDR, or sometimes you will also see hybrid categories, because there are some methods where people don't quite know where to put them, for example, biochar or enhanced mineral weathering. We simply don't use them because we think scientifically they are not very helpful, and quite often don't make too much sense because too much of a meaning is put into it when people say, okay, nature-based CDR has these or that properties versus technological CDR methods. We think it's more important to look at it method by method. So what we do there is a techno-economic analysis of 12 CDR methods, look at scenarios, mitigation scenarios, have some kind of feasibility assessment, look at costs and potentials, and also on governance and policies, but not so much, let's say, defining certain principles, but looking at the literature that is already analyzing what's happening on the ground, because at least in the area of forestry, a lot is happening already. And coming back, or let's say connecting it again with the sentence I read to you from the summary for policymakers, since we're now into a phase where over more than 100 governments, I think, worldwide have set a net zero target for the long term. We are now beyond the question CDR, yes or no, should we really do it? But more entering the phase of, okay, which CDR methods do we want to use? Who should do that, by when, at which volumes, and in which ways? And of course, the IPCC will not say, okay, this country has to do that and the other country has to do that. These are basically political issues. Here is a figure that has become quite popular recently. It's a stylized figure, so you could read it as a global trajectory, also as a national trajectory. It's more about the basic components, so you see no volumes here, no exact time scale, and it's more about the components. So if you look at the end of the century, 2100, there still will be, according to the science, residual emissions, something that is happening above the zero line, and most of it probably coming from non-CO2 greenhouse gases, mainly from agriculture. But also other so-called residual emissions from hard to abate sources, could be industry, could be aviation, and if you take a strict gross perspective on land use, then it's clear there also will be residual emissions from land use, probably or hopefully overcompensated by removals on managed land, and that's the dark green area here below the zero line, as you can see. And we know that, and you in Finland of course know that. We are already doing carbon dioxide removal, and in the European Union we have net negative LULUCF emissions in the US as well, in many European countries, but in Finland, of course, that's quite significant, in Sweden as well. So if you take that gross perspective, differentiating between emissions on managed land and removals on managed land, of course, you see much more. And below in the three boxes, you see three different functions of carbon dioxide removal. It accelerates net emissions reductions before you even get to net zero, which has been acknowledged in the EU now with the structure of the new 2030 target. You needed to get to net zero CO2 or GHG, which is quite a difference. I'll show you that in the next slide. And of course, you need that to reach net negative emissions, which is already foreseen in the EU climate law, for example, also I think in Finland, in Germany as well. But on the global level, we might need it if we overshoot the 1.5 degrees threshold. And here zooming into that same figure and now highlighting when we cross the net zero line, you see the dashed line is CO2, the non-dashed line is GHG. Net zero GHG emissions is much more ambitious, and it occurs later than achieving net zero CO2. You also need much more CDR. The very reason is you're counterbalancing non-CO2 emissions with CO2 emissions. So in terms of CO2, you are already at net negative CO2 levels in the year you reach net zero greenhouse gas levels. So how large differences depends basically on your emissions basket nationally. Also in the EU, there will be differences, considerable differences. It's very often about the status of agriculture within an economy, especially livestock farming, but it's not only about methane, it's also about nitrous oxide. So it's not only about livestock farming, but in a country like Ireland, where 33% of the emissions, national emissions, come from agriculture, this difference between net zero CO2 and GHG will be quite large. In other countries like Germany, maybe less than 10 years. But it's something that policymakers quite often overlook, that with setting a net zero GHG target, they not only committed themselves to carbon dioxide removal, but they already committed themselves to going net negative in terms of CO2. And you see some scenario work that, let's say, counteracts the impression that the IPCC can set a definitive number of how much CDR do we have to achieve. What you see here in the red box are different ways of getting to net zero. The IPCC uses the concept of illustrative mitigation pathways. Here it's the year of net zero CO2, so the colored boxes above and below the zero line are of the same size. The gray area is then the non-CO2 that comes up front, and you see, depending on where you go, IMPGS is a gradual strengthening of pledges. IMP-NEC has a strong focus on net negative emissions. LD is low demand. SP, I think, is sustainable development pathways. So the setup, the composition, even in global modeling, between residual emissions, where they exactly come from, and how you could counterbalance them, that's quite different. And here in that graph, you see LULUCF only on one side in net values, and at the point of net zero, it's of course expected that LULUCF would be already net negative. But if you would take a gross perspective, you would also have some green above the zero line still, and then more below the zero line to get the gross numbers. Here, I will not go into details here. It's just a warning that in the initially published IPCC assessment, they always come with tables of corrigenda already agreed upon in an interim phase. And in the version you will find now on the website, you will still have that table that is above table 3.5 in chapter 3 that gives you a total CDR number that has then been corrected later because we found out, our colleagues doing the scenarios found out that the cumulative CDR numbers coming from AFOLU or from LULUCF in regulatory terms, that there are some problems in terms of quantification. So right now, and you will see that in the final product that will be published in a typeset version, I think in 2 or 3 months from now, there are no total carbon dioxide removal numbers anymore, which, and at one point it's a pity, at the other hand, I think it's quite healthy, because quite often then proponents of CDR say, well, the IPCC says we need X gigatons of CDR by 2050. No, the IPCC doesn't. The IPCC would usually do scenarios to show the interactions, and it's always a little bit tricky to take then single numbers out of context, because these numbers depend on contextual factors and on many assumptions that are kind of hidden to non-experts, like discount rates in the long term, assumptions on residual emissions, on the core mitigation strategies I just showed you, but also on the assumption, will there be a temperature overshoot in the let's say rising or starting in the 2030s, and is this part of a strategy to allow for more emissions earlier and then get very high levels of net negative emissions later? So it all depends, and I think it's safe to say the IPCC never would like to say you need X gigatons of CDR by a certain year, but in that specific case, you will see in 2 months' time, there are not even such numbers. Here, a quick overview, but I think we will hear more about that in the next presentation on how the IPCC does sort the methods. Our main elements of the taxonomy is the removal process, let's say at the interface of the atmosphere and the method. So we, as I said, we don't use nature-based versus technological. It's land-based biological, ocean-based biological, geochemical and chemical. And you see these shadings on the top for the methods. But probably the most important part is the time scale of storage that can be attached to the methods or to certain implementation options. You find the implementation options below the first row. What's important to mention that CCS and CCU, so carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and utilization, can be part of CDR methods. Let's say bioenergy with CCS, direct air capture with CCS, for the CCS options, but also if you use wood in constructions, that's basically a CCU application that can be part of CDR methods when the CO2 is stored durably and when it comes from biomass or the ambient air. If you couple CCS or CCU with fossil fuel CO2, then it can be at best lead to a net zero emissions process, but not to a net negative process. And if you look for a dichotomy here, the only one you can see is land versus ocean-based, and that's simply only about the placement of the options, not necessarily the final reservoir. As you might know, I guess we will hear about that later. Enhanced mineral weathering would be done on land, on arable land, but finally the CO2 will be ending up in the ocean. Here, and of course we're not going to go into details, that's a table from Working Group 1 showing different sequestration potentials. Working Group 1 is about a climate system at large, so they have a different focus, so you won't find anything on costs here, but Earth system interactions, but it's already sorted not along technical or biogeophysical potential, but the time scale of carbon storage, because the IPCC, let's say, is of the opinion that while co-benefits are very important, we're doing carbon dioxide removal mainly for the main benefit, and that is extracting CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it away as long as we can. And here a final look at a very unedited version that's still online of overview tables we have in Working Group 3 on certain methods. Then there are always sections of flowing text behind that, where we look at method by method in terms of technical readiness level, cost, mitigation potential, risk and impacts, co-benefits, and other dimensions. You would find that in table 12.6 in the IPCC report. You will also find in the summary for policymaker this figure you might already have seen because it became quite popular, where we look at mitigation potential by 2030 in certain cost ranges. This is not the whole. This is not the whole table of options, but you see already in the energy part of it and in the AFOLO part of it, there are CDR methods, bioelectricity with CCS, or BECCS in the power sector, or carbon sequestration in agriculture, ecosystem restoration, afforestation, reforestation, and improved forest management. The final slide here, just some research needs and knowledge gaps. I know we will hear more about that in some other presentations. I think regarding the fundamentals, what needs to be done in the next IPCC cycle, but also started by regulators, clear definitions of durability, which should not be understood at the threshold of, okay, should we do it or not, but would lead to considerations. What do we do with methods that don't lead to quasi-permanent removal, because they might be needed as well, but we need monitoring, reporting, and verification of carbon flows and accounting system for that. The second part, characteristics of methods and pathways, that's quite clear, looking at costs and potentials, risk, co-benefits. But also, I think in many countries, the political question will arise if you focus on net zero, residual emissions versus carbon dioxide removal to counterbalance these residual emissions. I think this will lead to heated political debates also across the European Union. And in terms of governance and policy, the usual questions around feasibility, sustainability constraints, risk, and co-benefits. Certification and accounting, I think Christian Holzleitner will tell us more about that, and targeted incentives to get things going, especially for the carbon dioxide removal methods we are not doing already. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much indeed, Dr. Geden. I think I'm not the only one who finds the IPCC reports are extremely important, but also sometimes slightly difficult to absorb. So this kind of big picture conceptualizations and introductions are very much needed. I believe you will be able to stick around for the discussion, so we will come back, I'm sure, with many questions. And on that note, let me just invite our participants to make good use of the Q&A box. So you can submit questions to any of our speakers at any time throughout the webinar, and we will come back to those in just a couple of minutes. But before we do that, we have one more presentation, which comes from our colleague Alexander Resnitchenko, who is a research team leader at the Technical Research Center of Finland, VTT. And he will continue slightly on the same lines as Dr. Geden, looking at the technologies. Alex, you have the floor.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Oras. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex. I'm representing VTT in the CURPP project, and particularly the task which was dealing with an overview of technological landscape when it comes to carbon dioxide use and removal. So to further, do not dwell too much on the difficult question of taxonomy and definition, as very nicely pointed out by Dr. Geden. Still, perhaps a few points to consider for the rest of the presentation. Multiple technologies for either carbon dioxide capture and usage are rather agnostic with respect to the source of CO2, as the source of CO2 can range from a fossil carbon-based dioxide to biogenic carbon dioxide coming from sustainable biomass to carbon dioxide captured directly from the atmosphere. And of course, the products or the end-use cases of the captured CO2 can range from a short lifetime products such as fuel and energy carriers to long intermediate products, and of course long-term storage or long-term utilization of carbon dioxide. So basically, many of the technologies we will be talking about and the end-use cases can produce a variety of different matrices ranging from different combinations of the source of CO2 and the longevity of the storage. Yet, if we are interested to stay in the carbon negative or carbon removal domain of the technology, so if you will, the upper right corner of this table, then we should perhaps remember that we shall be looking mostly at the high permanence of the storage and capture, so long-lived products or permanent storage of CO2, and our CO2 source should be atmospheric or biogenic. So with further ado, let's dwell a bit more on the aspect of the CO2 source, with maybe some touch of the regional aspects here in Finland. So the diagram on the left depicts the distribution of the largest point source CO2 emitters in Finland. And as probably not surprising to most of you, the large forest, pulp and fiber industry in Finland contributes significantly to our point source of the largest emitters. And as a result, not only the emissions are dominated by the forest industry, but also the point source emissions in Finland are largely biogenic by nature. And that not only comes in the forest industry sector as such, but also a substantial portion of the thermal energy generation is also producing biogenic CO2 emissions, which may be of interest when we will be further considering different options for the capture and storage. So, but if we talk about the CO2 removal from our simple engineered perspective, I mean, basically there are two major interfaces or two major steps in that process. What we need to distinguish to further create an additional complexity of different matrices. Basically, we need to capture the CO2, and here we will be talking about direct air capture technologies from the atmosphere, capture from the point sources, capture from the atmosphere via biomass growth or ocean alkalinity management. So the step in which the CO2 gets concentrated and prepared for the end use and storage. And then on the other interface, the utilization and storage domain, we will be looking at options of storing CO2 in geological formations, using CO2 as a valuable product as such, conversion of CO2 in various products via CCU, and of course, we will try to focus on the applications or combinations of conditions where we allow to reach a high permanence of storage and utilization. So to start with the direct air capturing technologies, well, we've been all hearing that the rising concentration of CO2 in air is of course a high concern, but if we look at it from an engineering standpoint, CO2 concentration in ambient air is quite low, it's below 0.1%, and that would mean that if we were to do the job what the plant leaf is able to do by some technical means, we need to spend quite a substantial amount of energy to capture and concentrate this extremely diluted stream towards something what we can then handle further. We are, on the other hand, rather flexible, where we would like to put our installation for the direct air capture plant. So this nice plant in Iceland, one of the pioneering facilities with a pilot scale capacity of 4 kilotons of CO2 captured from the air annually, has been built in Iceland, not because Iceland has a lot of volcanoes and there is more CO2 in air there than in Finland. Actually, just as much as everywhere else. However, you can benefit with that installations with integrations with available energy or suitable interfaces with the end use storage and application. And in that particular case, there's a lot of abundant energy available to run this otherwise very energy demanding process, and the good synergies with end storage facilities. So the direct air capture or DAC technologies at the moment coming at a significant price with both capital and operational expenses. The technology readiness level is at the moment that rather large scale or early stage demo, and there's quite a lot of announcements that further capacities with high TRL are either being designed or soon will be commissioned. At the moment, the usage of DAC technologies and the highly dilute nature of the air as a raw material for CO2 results in a rather high capture cost, ranging from several hundreds of euros per ton of CO2. There are some optimistic projections that these costs can be pushed down as the technology maturation goes on, but for now, it still remains a rather expensive technology to run if you want to use your air as a source of CO2 for further either utilization or storage. Well, when it comes to point source of CO2, for which I gave you already a hint of what these sources are, in particular in Finnish context, the situation is quite different. Now we are not anymore as flexible geographically as we would be in the case of direct air capture. So we need to be next to the source where CO2 is being produced. And sometimes that brings additional restriction with respect to available space, energy, and utility integration on the site. However, the benefit is that the CO2 streams from the most industrial relevant processes, from combustion, fermentation, steel and cement production, and of course pulp mills, the concentration of CO2 is much higher in the stream. We are talking about streams with concentration between 10 and 70%. The quality may vary, but the benefit of a highly concentrated streams allows to run this operation in a much more economical scale. And as a result, the technology of capturing CO2 from waste source has been commercial for several decades. It is now at TRL 8.9 with a reasonable, very slowly creeping up global capacity, but there are commercial scale installations which have been running over several decades already, and from them we can know that operation costs are substantially lower than in the case of direct air capture. In some very particular cases of, for example, ethanol fermentation plants, these costs can be pushed down to even lower because of a very specific nature of the waste streams coming from the ethanol fermentation. So, and looking at the possible available large point sources of CO2 in Finland, here is the actual one of the largest CO2 emitters, or perhaps the largest CO2 emitters in Finland, the Äänekoski bioproduct mill, which is producing up to 2 million tons of CO2, largely, almost entirely biogenic in nature. So feedstock availability is now not going to be a huge issue in this particular scenario. So, well, if we kind of roughly divide the CO2 capture by point source and direct air capture, next question is what to do with the captured CO2. And to a surprise of some, the CO2 itself is actually a very useful molecule. It has a sizable global market with the projected reasonable growth. Majority of applications, unfortunately, go towards food industry, food packaging, and promotion of plant growth. So if we look at this from a standpoint of longevity of storage or permanence, there is little to none to this, with a very important exception of an enhanced oil recovery, which is actually a commercial process, especially in some parts of North America. So from the standpoint of longevity or permanence of capture of CO2, this can be, of course, a viable option, but I mean, fundamentally, this is now a process in which we are enhancing extraction of an additional fossil carbon above the ground, which is probably not the right thing to do in a grand scheme of events. What is probably a more viable option to do is of course, the geological storage, which, like I said, has been on the market for several decades, and storage in suitable geological formations has been brought to a mature and industrially applicable scale with the costs which are rather modest. If, of course, with different scenarios should be considered. Unfortunately, rather comprehensive studies run in Finland and some other countries in the Baltic area as well have come to a conclusion that there are, due to combination of geological and geographical factors, there are no appropriate sites in Finland to pursue storage of CO2 in some geological formations. The nearest feasible location would be the offshore area of North Sea, somewhat off the coast of Norway, which might be seen as the most viable and the closest point to store CO2 produced in Finland. There are some feasibility studies on that matter in private sectors, but there's no kind of centralized framework promoting usage of CCS in Finland as such. However, there are some much less technically mature developments which are going on the pilot scale currently, which deal with storage in geological formations via CO2 mineralizations. There is a number of piloting projects exploring the possibility of integrating CO2 storage with certain mining operations which are producing a surplus of minerals able to store CO2 chemically in a way, and rather large potential for the gigaton scale storage of CO2 has been highlighted in some of the studies. But this must be pointed out that we are talking now about extremely low TRL, where it's very difficult to define the actual range of applicability and the range of operating costs we will be dealing with. Well, if we can't store it, what would be the utilization, CO2 utilization options beyond the ones already highlighted, such as via biomass, timber products, biochar, and storage in geological formation? CO2 is a rather unreactive and extremely stable form of carbon, so it takes some external energy to activate it and transform it into some further useful products. However, there are some rather concrete cases, then, for example, reactive waste, reactive ashes or slags or metal oxides can be reacted with CO2 to produce very useful minerals fillers or artificial aggregates like calcium carbonate, for example. So these things, they go into a very long-term applications such as constructions, concrete, and other construction-like applications. And currently these are being piloted at advanced piloting or early demonstration scales with some variation in technology readiness level depending on the particular inorganic product or inorganic aggregate. Same can be said that same pathway can be used when some organic energy carrier, such as reactive epoxide intermediate, is reacted with CO2. We can then generate a number of CO2 containing, if you will, products, synthetic polymers, such as polycarbonate and polycarbonate polyols. So these are essentially, large volume organic commodities, and some of these processes have already been brought to commercial scale, where the actual commercial volumes of polymers produced using CO2 are now being sold on the market. Potentially, there is, as you can see from the volumes of these products, there is a substantial potential for these products. Of course, the longevity and the permanence of removal will highly depend on the end application of the synthetic resins. We are not anymore talking about, of course, geological times, but depending on whether it goes into construction or performance energy carrying type of applications, we can talk about some decades to hundreds of years in terms of lifetime of the polymer resins. Still, this type of approaches require some high energy intermediates to be reacted with CO2 to bring it to allow to activate that molecule and make it more useful. So speaking about some ultimate ways to activate CO2, of course, perhaps the most powerful and most universal way to activate CO2 and make it a beginning of all standard value chains currently used in petrochemical industry would be the so-called power-to-X approach, where a combination of renewable hydrogen produced with low carbon or carbon-free electricity would allow to produce strategic intermediates such as methane, methanol, paraffins, or olefins. So these are materials which are the backbone of the current petrochemical industry, and of course they can be further downstream processed into either energy carriers such as jet fuels or diesel fuels or even gasoline, or some more interesting applications with respect to longevity such as synthetic polymers, for example. So depending on the combination of the intermediate, whether it's methanol or paraffins or olefins, and what is the end products, there's currently a lot of interest in piloting and demonstrating these type of approaches across the industry clusters. And of course, if we talk about, generally speaking, petrochemical products and synthetic polymers, potential markets are quite huge. But the high energy demand, the energy needed to produce the green hydrogen, and we needed to activate CO2 and convert it further into these useful downstream products, is in fact enormous. If we looked at some cost comparison, then basically these commodities will be made at price double or triple that of the production price using current fossil sources. So an interesting and potentially very useful approach in domains for emission reductions and perhaps even net zero, and to some extent carbon removal technologies, but a lot to be done with respect to the technology development and addressing the huge disparity and in the product prices, if we were to really consider this path as a way for the carbon removal technologies. So this in practice has been just a snapshot of a certain combinations of the capture technologies and end use cases for the carbon removal process. Please take a look at our report draft, which has been now distributed to all the participants of these webinars. There's probably some very important technologies which were not discussed in the current presentation, such as biochar or ocean alkalinity management as such. But for now, our preliminary conclusion is that if we look from the technology domain standpoint, there is no kind of magic bullet that technology-driven solution which would allow for an easy, viable market penetration of these carbon removal technologies, especially if we look at the segments where the product will be just purely competing with the fossil-based products. Most of these technologies, with maybe some important exceptions of the CCS, still require substantial RDI effort, as we are talking about some early pilot scale stages, and a lot of demonstrations, scale up and integration is to be done by the industry. And it is very likely that, like has been highlighted by Dr. Gainen, that no matter how hard hard are the engineers working on making these technologies more viable, additional incentivation would be needed in order to make industry to really go for the investments in this area. So, I mean, we are about halfway in our project, so please take a look at our report. Please send your comments and questions into the chat box. I mean, basically, and within the remainder of the project, we still want to give our best bet on what shall be the winning combination of renewable technologies and end use, which would find good synergies with, let's say, with the regional constraints and requirements, but also opportunities what we have in Finland in terms of, let's say, feedstock availability, available value chain, and available end use markets. And of course, we need to also understand that from a technical standpoint, VTT is a technology developer in the area. So we are also interested to know on what are the key technology areas to be addressed and where should the effort be focused if we want to reach scalable, economical, and soon to be deployable technical solutions for the CO2 use and removal. So that was just a teaser. Please take a look at our report, and of course, looking forward to hearing your questions and comments in the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. We will soon be taking questions from the Q&A and adding questions there. They are very, really interesting and valuable. But before we do that, we also have another way for you to contribute, which is an online tool called Padlet. My colleague Helena will share a link in the chat. And if you click the link, you will get questions that some of you may find familiar if you had a chance to look at the survey we shared with all of you before this event. If not, no worries, you can still easily contribute by answering the questions there. So perhaps during the break, while you're getting some tea or coffee, you want to have a look at the questions, starting perhaps with the 2 questions that Alex finished his presentation with. Now, if anything that could be said about the 2 presentations is that we are talking about a wildly rich and diverse field of different solutions and applications. So it's a lot to take in. Now, time for the questions. And I believe, Dr. Gaiden, you volunteered to answer at least some of them that were already posed.
Yes, I did the one on the inventories. I wasn't sure in the chat or the Q&A function if the question on CO2 sequestration in agriculture really had been answered. That was in that 2030 figure from the SPM. It's soil carbon sequestration on agricultural lands, probably also agroforestry. When you see these kind of aggregation of knowledge, of course, some detail always gets lost. I remember in the chat, there was also the question on the permanence categorization of biochar. I think that was referring to the working group 1 figure. Of course, biochar has many applications, and I think we see that also where you store it. If you put it into soils, which is good for soil fertility, you will get probably to permanence times not as high as if you would use it in building materials or in street construction, road construction. So of course it's always some kind of aggregation going on here and trying to cover a broader set of implementation options, and of course especially with biological land-based biological CDR methods, it really depends on the country, on the climate area, also the climate zone, and also on the specific site, how a method would really fare. So I think that will happen quite naturally once we get into national implementation. Of course, in forestry we are already there, but we will see all these kinds of differentiation. But on the other hand, let's say it gets you into trouble in regulation, because if you want to come up with uniform European Union rules on how to do the certification of certain methods and their removal potential, you always have to make these kind of compromises and working with proxy levels. We already see that, let's say, in the biofuels regulation, where we have numbers for indirect land use change in 300 types of soils across the world, where we have conversion factors. That's really a problem we often face in regulating carbon dioxide removal, which will have to be covered by the certification scheme to be proposed by the European Commission, I think, by the end of November.
Indeed, and we will come back to that in the second part of the webinar when we have a Commission representative here. Dr. Gaden, I wonder, you already typed a written answer to the question about inventory guidelines. Did you want to summarize that perhaps in a couple of sentences here?
Yeah, so BECS you can principally include, although there is, as you know, quite some fierce criticism regarding BECS installations that would depend on imported biomass, and then for BECS, the biomass part, or the biomass part in bioenergy, there are rules how to account for land use change under LULUCF regulations. But if you import it, the biomass, like the Drax power plant in the UK intends to, then you basically account for it in your country as carbon neutral biomass, and then you bring it underground and may be credited for negative emissions, while there's no guarantee that in the country of origin there would be proper accounting under LULUCF. Direct air capture you can do under UNFCCC inventory rules. For other methods, it's a similar problem. The recent change that has happened is for biochar in the 2019 IPCC refinement. All this is only going to change if governments ask for it. And I think once governments try to do that at home, not only in the European Union, also in the UK, in the US, of course they will want that to be acknowledged in their UNFCCC national emissions inventory. So I would expect to see movement there, but I think we are at a phase where, for example, the UK and the EU or EU member states would have to have exchanges about really also practical issues of monitoring, reporting, and verification of these carbon flows. But I think this will be a bottom-up process.
Thank you very much. I see that Alex already responded to one of the questions also in written form. I wonder, Alex, if you wanted to summarize both the question and the answer for the rest of the audience here.
Well, the question was on whether CO2-based products are competitive against fossil, petroleum-based, and the second question was what would be the major difference in non-combusted products between these two sources. So to start with the first and easier one, I think at least the conclusions, what we can make from BTT's experience in a number of projects considering very different value chains. I mean, it is impossible to really hope for CO2-based product ever being competitive with the fossil-based, simply due to the fact that there's so much energy need to be brought up to CO2 in order to make it of the same energy value as, for example, naphtha or natural gas or any other fossil type of hydrocarbon. And that is probably the reality we'll have to live with. And of course, how much would that premium be would very much depend on the energy prices. And in some of the calculations we did few years back for some commodity materials, basically e-fuels and e-polymers and e-chemicals are roughly can be twice more expensive than the respective commodities made out of fossil-based material.
Thank you. There are a lot of policy-related questions in the chat. We do come back to the policy side of the discussion in the latter half of the webinar. I just wonder, I'm not going to do justice to these different comments and questions, but One way to summarize the chat discussion would be that there are those people who are advocating for, let's say, direct air capture. Some people think that biochar is the way to go, and then there are people saying that BECCS could play an important role, or CCU. Dr. Gaden, I just wonder, when you have people who want an answer to which technology or which solution should we go for and choose, what would be your answer to that?
I think it will be basically a political question, but it would also be a question of administrative capacity. And I think this will be very interesting about the certification scheme, because so many proponents of certain methods, of course, would hope that their method is covered by the Commission proposal, but probably you cannot do it all. So somebody would need to make a decision, although the proposal is only a proposal. So the Parliament and the member states will still have their say. I cannot really answer that question. Also, we will have different political preferences and also different conditions. Also, if you integrate carbon dioxide removal, if you are able to integrate carbon dioxide removal in existing value chains and application, that is a strong argument that you would do it. I think there are very many balls in the air, and I think some tough decisions have to be made, and it also depends on what happens in other countries. Take direct air capture. The US seems to be betting on it, whether it's for utilization or for long-term removal. And of course, the European Union could say, well, maybe this time, different from what we saw with solar PV and wind power, let the Americans buy the costs down, and then we just do the take-up. I think that's really also an industrial policy decision. Or another related decision, I think, Esa Vakilainen has been asking about. Do we use mandates for green kerosene to really accelerate direct air capture? Because that seems to be the market right now. If you have a mandate, blending mandates, and maybe getting them to 100% by 2050 or whatever year, where does the CO2 come from? I mean, everybody's talking about green hydrogen, but for green kerosene, you would also need green CO2, if you want to say so. I mean, maybe in an interim phase, you can take fossil fuel based process emission based CO2, maybe from the cement industry. These are all strategic decisions, and the problem is it very easily gets very technical, and for policymakers quite confusing. What are the methods to bet on? But in the end, it will be a decision of political processes, and there will be no optimal outcome. And I'm pretty sure some methods will be untreated fairly and some unfairly in the process, but we need to leave room for adjustments here. Also, we might, let's say, downgrade certain methods initially because we think the monitoring, reporting, verification cannot be done, and then see 5 years later, okay, there are now ways with remote sensing or certain modeling methodologies to do that. I think the decisive battleground for that in the European Union will be that certification scheme, and which methods will be covered and which are not. So if you manage to get something out on that of Christian Holzleitner, then it would be interesting to hear. But usually, of course, he doesn't show his cards already.
Thank you very much. We will definitely try our best. Indeed, we will come back to the EU certification plans soon enough, as well as the policy points. Also, the IPCC guidelines, Sampo Soimakallio will be referring to those as well. There was one comment in the chat about a new technology, accelerated carbon technology, TRL9. Perhaps Alex can take note of that. But for now, I would like to thank very much our keynote speaker, Dr. Gaden, as well as our friends and colleagues from the project. Now would be a time for a short break. We were thinking that it may be a good idea to perhaps stretch your legs and arms a bit, perhaps get a cup of tea or coffee, and not to forget the Padlet questions that will be open. So please do use this time to have a look at the questions and also share your responses. Regarding the questions in the chat, can I please invite the participants, if at all possible, to resubmit some of the questions in the Q&A, especially regarding policies, as we will come back to the policy discussion in the second half of the webinar. But for now, we are going to take a 15-minute break and we will come back at past. Welcome back from the break. I hope you had a good opportunity to either relax a little or perhaps do something productive, like answer a couple of urgent emails, whichever is your preference. I at least got another cup of tea in my sloth cup, so I'm well prepared for the second half of our webinar. And for that, we are excited and proud to welcome our second keynote speaker, who is Mr. Christian Holzleitner from the European Commission. He has such an impressive title that I actually have to read it to make sure that I get everything right, which is the Head of Unit for Land Economy and Carbon Removals at the Directorate General for Climate Action. And if the title is impressive, so is his job as well. And he will be introducing especially the EU policies on sustainable carbon cycles. So thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Holzleitner. You have the floor.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. Very happy to be with you and to tell you a bit about our current work on carbon removals here in Brussels. So I'm going to share my presentation. Okay. Should be good now, and you should be seeing it.
Yes.
So I can get started. And what is our big objective here in Europe is to become the first climate neutral economy in 2050. And this means, on balance, we will not add any more CO2 to the atmosphere. So for this, in the first place and foremost, we have to reduce our emissions. We have to reduce our dependency on fossil carbon. And as unfortunately the last months have shown, there are very important, maybe even overriding geopolitical reasons why we should do this, why we should get off our fossil carbon. Of course, for this, we must then substitute fossil carbon with other types of carbon, like biogenic carbon, light carbon that we get directly out of the air, because we will still need carbon in industry. We still need to eat carbon as well. But we'll still have emissions in 2050, and probably the most of those emissions will come from agriculture. So it will be the non-CO2 emissions from livestock, as well as from the fertilizer use. So to get to this magic zero, we need to actively store more carbon in our soils, in our forests. So in agriculture, in forestry, we must also get better at using biogenic carbon in more long-lasting products, like in construction materials. So to also bind carbon there and not to release it too early to the atmosphere. And of course, we also have to look into geological storage, so to bring the carbon back to the underground. So our economy in 2050 will be a different one. It will be a non-fossil economy, and we must understand how we can produce more sustainably non-fossil carbon, be it from growing it in the forest, biogenic carbon, be it through direct air capture, be it by using the carbon from waste streams. But then we also must use it more sustainably, and we must get better in storing it. So this means, as already said before, like for biogenic carbon, let's use it less for energy. We have cheaper energy sources like wind and solar, and use biogenic carbon more for the industry. And if we still use it for energy, let's combine it with carbon capture and storage, so that the CO2 emissions don't go to the atmosphere, but back underground. So, and what I also find so exciting when looking at the bioeconomy, we can really get climate positive value chains. So for the first time, we could show that producing goods is not negative for the climate, but positive, because we can store more carbon. So still a little bit in our vision for 2050, what do we think that could be stored in soils, in forests, in bioproducts? So currently, we remove each year around 260 million tons of carbon. That by 2050, we could see that we could push that between 400 and 500 million tons. So that would be this famous sink. So what do we take in every year into soils, forests, and bioproducts? And that difference between 400 or 500, of course, depends on how much land we have available, also for forests. And of course, that will be driven, for example, by the diets. The less meat we eat, the more land we have available for other uses. If we look at the industrial side, so we would think that by 2050, we would need to capture around between 300 and 500 million tons of CO2 that would come from direct air capture, from industrial processes, from biogenic carbon. Then this is the CO2 we would need to store or to use in industrial processes. And of course, this difference, this range, again comes from, okay, how much land do we have available for storing carbon there? In terms of the use, you see that that a large part of the captured carbon would go to synthetic fuels. So that would be mostly for air transport. You would have it as feedstock for materials, and then an amount of it also for underground storage. And you see in these two scenarios, of course, if we store less in our natural environment, we need to put more underground. So there's quite a significant difference between the two. So how do we get there? So that was a bit the vision of where we would need to get to in the next 30 years. But how do we actually get there? What are the first steps that we can take to a more sustainable carbon economy? Carbon farming. The idea is, how can we set better incentives for land managers to store more carbon while growing forests, while growing food? So for every ton of additional carbon removed, the land manager would get 40-50 euros. A lot of those actions, like rewetting of peatlands, agroforestry, are also good for biodiversity. Like close to nature, reforestation and afforestation is good for the climate adaptation of our forests, which we need so much, as shown this year. So the measures that you have with carbon farming, with building up more soil carbon, are not only good for climate, they are also good for biodiversity, and they are good for the land productivity and the resilience. So we would be looking for this triple win solutions. And we see a lot of interest across Europe in setting better incentives for more sustainable agriculture and forestry that leaves more carbon in the forests, in the soils. And you see interest from different sides. Of course, the first one is within the value chains in the bioeconomy. So the producers of food and biomass, let's take, for example, Unilever or one of the bigger food companies, they are all keen to show to their investors, to their consumers, that they have a climate neutral or maybe even climate positive value chain. So they have an interest to finance a change in the practices of the land managers. Then, of course, there's also the idea of voluntary carbon markets. So that, for example, airlines would be interested to buy those carbon removals from the bioeconomy and then to offset their own emissions, to claim towards their customers, okay, if you fly with me, at least a certain amount of those emissions is compensated by additional action in other sectors. This comes with a lot of integrity problems that we still need to tackle, but that's another way of financing. And of course, then there's also a lot of public interest through the common agricultural policy, but also outside. We see more and more member states that take like a certain share of their revenues from the emission trading system and invest it into more climate-friendly agriculture and forestry. So there is a variety of business models or financing options, and I would like to keep a very open mind on that. But irrespective of the financing model that you're looking into, you first need to know how much carbon is stored, for how long, and what are the effects on sustainability. So you really want to know that you're doing something good, something additional. And for that, you need a very reliable monitoring, reporting, and verification. You need advisory services for the land managers, and it must be simple for them to understand what to do. And at the end of my presentations, I'll come back to our proposal on the certification of carbon removals that should exactly tackle those issues. Okay, then on the industrial side, as I said, we need biogenic carbon. We need carbon captured from the air to substitute fossil carbon as a feedstock, like in the chemical industry, to produce materials, chemicals, fuels, and so on. And of course, in the meantime, we should also use the CO2 in waste streams that are possibly still from fossil origin, and try to understand how can we use that then also in industrial processes. So we must start to change the feedstock from fossil to non-fossil carbon. And with our innovation fund, we are by now already financing quite a large number of such projects. So, sorry. If, as you know, the innovation fund is financed by the revenues of our emission trading system, and we want to support those companies that invest already now in the technologies that we need in 2050, that we need for a climate neutral economy. And you see here some examples that are relevant to our discussion today. So, for example, we have the district heating plant in Stockholm that's run on biomass residues, and the idea is to take out the CO2 from the waste streams and put it under the North Sea. So, and by that, you would have a climate positive value chain. So sustainably grown biomass used for bioenergy, and with CCS, you don't let the carbon go to the atmosphere. From the last call of the Innovation Fund, we have 4 carbon capture and use projects in chemicals, like the production of methanol from residues. We have one producing fibers, polymers from biogenic carbon. We have our biggest project is the carbon capture and storage from chemical and hydrogen production in Port of Antwerp. So this is still fossil carbon that's taken out there from the waste streams and put again under the North Sea, like in Norway or Rotterdam. But of course, the technology there is then equally relevant for any other type of carbon. And we also see a strong number of carbon capture and storage projects in the cement industry, and there you see also in Eastern Europe, like Poland and Bulgaria. And then also from the last call, we have a very interesting project on carbon storage in Iceland. So the storage in basalt, which gives quite a cost competitive solution. So, and what is needed to get all this CCUS industry started is, of course, an open access transport network for the CO2. Then we have a sufficient number of storage sites, but also on capture facilities, so that we quickly get to a liquid market there, and make it more attractive for more and more companies to enter here. And we can really have a scale up and really develop a kind of it's a bit of a different carbon market than in the emission trading system, but there will be really a true carbon market where carbon is traded. So, and now to finish my presentation, I want to tell you a bit about our upcoming proposal on having a regulatory framework for the certification of carbon removals. As I've already said before, in particular for carbon farming, we need to create more trust in those activities, so that the ones who want to invest in a more climate-friendly agriculture and forestry are really sure that they get something good in return for their money. So what do I mean there? That we develop a well-defined methodology on how to quantify how much carbon is removed, whether that amount is additional, so it compares to a baseline, to a normal activity of soil management, so that it's clearly shown. This is something that goes beyond what's happening currently on the market, that there are good incentives to keep the carbon stored, so that there is a monitoring period, that there are rules on the liability, that the ones like the land managers have the right incentives to keep the carbon stored. Then, of course, we also want to be sure that those carbon removals have also positive impacts on sustainability. So we don't want to go like into this fast-growing monoculture forests, but also in view of the changes that we see in climate, we need very resilient forests, for example, and that should, of course, be reflected in here. So, and our proposal, with which we want to come out by the end of this year, in this framework, should set out those quality criteria. And then it will also set out how this governance scheme is working, so how the certification is working. We're looking, like, for example, how certification works with organic farming, with sustainable bioenergy under the Renewables Directive. And I think all the certification bodies, verifiers, could also be interested in the certification of carbon removals. So it should be a framework that covers the large range of carbon removals that we can have, from geological storage over carbon farming to storage and products. So I think the prime example is here, construction products. And then based on that framework, we would like to develop the specific methodologies for all those different types of carbon farming. And that we want to do together with an expert group starting from next year. We've already launched a call for experts, which is going on until the 15th of September. That expert group should have around 70 participants, so all the relevant actors, the member states, the public authorities, the certification bodies, the ones who are producing the carbon removals, like the land managers, like the ones who are active in industry, be it BECS, be it DAX, and of course NGOs, and also the ones who are ready to finance those carbon removals. So I would hope that we get a very good discussion there. I want to keep that expert group as open as possible and as transparent as possible. I would hope that this really gets the group as from next year to discuss carbon removals in Europe. So that was my my overview on what's happening here. Hope that had been useful, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much indeed, Mr. Holtleitner, for presenting the EU plans and policies on reaching sustainable carbon cycles. I think the Commission communication was received quite well in the field of people working on this topic. And I'm also happy that you mentioned the Innovation Fund support to the Stockholm Exergi's BECS project, because I can literally see it from our window here in Stockholm. Mr. Holtleitner, I believe you have the opportunity to stay with us for the discussion later on. So I would just invite all of our participants to put your questions in the Q&A box. We will definitely come back to those. We have a lot of questions to Mr. Holtleitner and other speakers. But for now, I would move on to the next presentation, which we will be hearing from Heidi Saastamoinen, who is working also at the Technical Research Center of Finland as a research scientist, and she will dive a bit deeper into the markets and projects regarding these carbon dioxide use and removal solutions. Heidi, go ahead.
Thanks. Can you see my screen properly?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I'm Heidi Saastamoinen from VTT Technical Research Center of Finland. And I'm going to give you an overview of carbon dioxide use and removal projects and markets. This review is based on our work package 2 in this project, which objective is systematic overview of carbon dioxide removal relevant markets. We are on halfway in this work package, so far we have reviewed the current status and developments. And in the next half, we will go further into the future and try to evaluate the growth opportunities for Finland and export potential. I want to start my presentation with these borrowed figures. On left-hand side, I have IPCC figure of annual CO2 sequestration scenarios that they have collected in their Working Group 3 report from different sources. These should limit global warming to below 2 degrees. And why I wanted to show this figure is that, as you can see here, the median is the black line. We need carbon dioxide sequestration of almost exponential growth in this in the coming coming decade before 2023, and after that linear growth in adopting these technologies. On the right hand side I have IEA figure from IEA, which looks this from another perspective, what kind of sources of CO2 are there that we should capture CO2 from. But both of these figures, they show similar view and numbers. Then if we go to European, Nordic and Finnish outlook, as Mr. Holtzleitner said in a previous presentation, Europe aims at capturing 300 million tons of CO2 by 2050. In Nordic scenarios, the number is 25 million tons, and in Finland, 9 million tons of CO2. Especially related to Nordic scenario, I believe this is quite reachable. In right-hand side, I have a figure of a Norwegian Breivik CCS demonstration plant and their plans for the future. And this is something that is done a lot around the North Sea. So there will be capturing ongoing. How much CO2 is actually used today? This is again from IEA, and they say that in 2025, the global demand for CO2 will be 270 million tons per year. And this is mainly to urea production and for enhanced oil recovery. Europe's demand of this was 16% in 2019. And these novel uses of CO2 will be something additional to this, and these are something that are under development at the moment. For instance, in Finland, we have projects related to CO2 capture to polymers, chemicals, synthetic fuels. However, these novel uses, they are not yet reported on how much CO2 is captured there. At the moment, insignificant anyhow to these common uses. To harvest what is captured, or to harvested food products such as paper and board or building materials. This is something that is reported by, for instance, in Finland by Statistics Finland, and this information is collected by Eurostat from member states as well. If we go to the CO2 markets in EU, we have, as you all know, emission trading scheme. There are similar schemes around the world as well. For instance, in South Korea, in China, in North America, New Zealand, but the EU ETS corresponded in 2021 around 90% of the global carbon market value, which was nearly 700 billion euros. And the market here has grown rapidly, mainly because of the increase in allowance prices. The price ended above 80 euros per ton of CO2 during 2021. Then globally, we have a voluntary carbon offset market, which is run by different platforms and service providers. And in this market here, companies, also, why not also private persons can compensate their own CO2 emissions. For instance, if they want to prove their claims for carbon neutrality. However, although internationally this market has been relatively small, for instance, compared to EU ETS. It has steered over $5 billion during the last 20 years. Top year was 2011 with market of $600 million. Also, the projects in which these compensations are put are not yet based on removals. Mainly, they are based on reductions, which means avoidance of emissions somewhere. For instance, there has been renewable energy production project, afforestation and land use project in where the offsets can be put. However, the markets for removals are emerging. The problem is that there, for instance, for DAX projects or BECS projects, there are no clear standards yet how to use them in the voluntary market. But as far as I know, these are coming. Then, what actually is done to store CO2? Here I have a figure from Global CCS Institute, and as you can see, there are not yet very many CCS facilities in construction. However, the projects in development the number of projects in development is increasing, hopefully exponentially, so that we can reach the scenarios. Another figure that I have borrowed from a zero emission platform, this shows CCS projects on pipeline to be operational by 2030 in Europe. There are about 50 projects here marked. There are also other institutions and organizations that have collected similar data, and it looks about the same. But I like this map. You can go to Zero Emission Platform website to see in more detail what is behind these points. However, this map so nicely shows where the projects today are mainly located around the North Sea, where there is a good underground places to store CO2. Also, you can see the countries here that are steering the development: Norway, United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Belgium. So how much carbon is actually captured today? There is one CCS project ongoing that captures 1 million tons of CO2 per year. In Norway, it's called Sleipner CCS. There was another about the same size, but unfortunately there was a fire in the plant that was capturing CO2, and at least I do not know the status of this project at the moment. However, the good news is that there should be a lot more coming up with similar way of capturing CO2 from industry clusters, where there are a lot of different actors emitting and capturing and build CO2 transport from these plants to permanent storage, for instance, there underneath the seabed in North Sea. Here I have 4 example projects listed. Maybe one of the most famous is the Longship project and Northern Lights project in Norway. The Stockholm XRT CCS, I believe that is also going to be, the CO2 from that project is also going to be transported to this hub. More than four clusters in Europe, and many of these are aiming at scale of capturing million tons of CO2 per year, and starting by 2030. Some of them are also planning to increase the capturing furthermore once a few years has gone. Then if we go to direct air capture, the capturing project in Iceland was also mentioned in the previous presentation. So Orca plant in Hellisheiði, Iceland is capturing at the moment 4,000 tons of CO2 per year to basaltic bedrock, but they are aiming at extending the storage by 2026. There are also a few other direct air capture plants in Europe, but these are still quite small in size compared to those hub storages that are planned. One interesting option to capture CO2 for a longer time is mineralization. So here CO2 plus industrial waste are made to mineral products that would bind CO2 for a longer time. For instance, artificial aggregates, as you can see here, the pictures, or to concrete blocks. And today there are already 3 commercial scale plants in United Kingdom, 2 and 1 in France, and these are capturing 25,000 tons of CO2 per year at the moment. The problem in this market is that there are different technologies with different TRL levels, and there are limitations still with material performance and durability of the products compared to conventional. Also, some standardization is still needed in order to make these products to markets. So to conclude my presentation, we need to adapt technologies related to carbon dioxide removal and carbon capture and storage. Currently, we are storing less than 2 million tons per year of CO2 in Europe. We aim at 30 million tons by 2030, but we should capture 300 million tons by 2050. At the moment in Europe, 40 million tons of CO2 is used approximately. We have emission trading scheme worth of approximately 700 billion euros, and global voluntary carbon offset market, which is still relatively small compared to this compliance carbon market, but it is there. Not yet based so much on removals, but rather avoidance. And the legislation is evolving related to carbon dioxide removal, which has also effect on markets. Here I have the questions that will be asked from the audience in the end of the next presentation. Hopefully we get a lot of answers to these. Thanks.
Indeed, and thank you very much. Request and use that I think Helena can read in the chat again. To answer those questions that Heidi just posed to all of you, we would like to hear from your expertise and your perspectives and use that in our project. We now have one final presentation to go, going closer to policies, and we will be hearing from Sampo Soimakallio, who is the head of unit at the Finnish Environment Institute, first. And again, as a reminder, do write your questions to the Q&A box, and we will definitely come back to those in a moment. And with this presentation, you are ready to go, Sampo.
Thank you very much, Oras, and good late afternoon, everyone. I hope you are still there. So due to technical matters, unfortunately, Oras has to share the slides because it didn't work in my computer, but let's not matter about that. So I will give, or we will give actually together with Oras a quick overview on the policy work package, what we have found out this far in our project. So could you take the next slide, please? So we will share this presentation so that I will first talk about the two first mentioned bullet points. I start with the basic greenhouse gas reporting to the international climate conventions, and then I touch the issue related to greenhouse gas accounting under the EU regulation. And I also say some words about certain key other EU climate or energy regulation and how they are related to the CCUS. And then after that, Oras will continue and talk about the preliminary results about this international benchmarking on national policies. Next slide, please. So first of all, this greenhouse gas reporting to the, let's say, UNFCCC or Paris Agreement, this is the whole basis of basically everything in climate policy. So the fundamental aim, of course, is to report the anthropogenic emissions and removals appropriately. And this creates the fundamental basis that we can monitor how greenhouse gas balances within the countries are developing and how far or close different countries then are of the commitments they have provided. So this is really important in that sense. And the IPCC provides the guidelines for doing these greenhouse gas inventories. And the fundamental principle there is that fossil CO2 emissions are reported as such, but biomass carbon is not reported as such. It's reported as carbon stock changes under the LULUCF sector. And regarding the CCUS, one very important principle there is that the captured CO2, it basically must be permanently stored in order to allow that such emissions can be deducted from the balances. Next slide, please. Regarding greenhouse gas accounting, which basically means that we account the realized or realizing greenhouse gas emissions towards certain policy targets, applying different types of rules. So this is important, of course, considering incentives or penalties and how economic operators and national economies face different things. So basically, the key elements in the EU climate policy are these three different elements: the EU Emissions Trading Directive, the effort sharing decision, which provides non-ETS targets for the member states, and then the LULUCF regulation. But there are also other relevant regulation related to this topic. First of all, Renewable Energy Directive, which provides mandatory targets to increase the use of renewable energy and also promotes the use of liquid and gaseous transportation fuels. There is a link to the CCU products. And also CCS directive provides basically rules for safe storage of CO2. Next slide, please. So here's a kind of summary table. I need to say that this is a preliminary version and might change until the when we complete this project. But basically, it shows the categorization of different types of carbon removal technologies, and then under which sector the CO2 captured and stored or CO2 removed from the atmosphere is then reported in the greenhouse gas inventories. And in the right, there is also the links to the EU regulation, under which EU regulation the CO2 is accounted, and then the links to the other relevant legislation. So first of all, there are, of course, so-called land-related carbon removal technologies like afforestation, reforestation, soil carbon management, biochar, things like that. So they are, in principle, all reported under the LULUCF sector. Considering that the rules and methods and data applied by the reporting country sees this kind of technology. So it's not necessarily so that everything, when we apply new technologies, they are visible directly in the inventory. So, but in case they are visible there, they are reported under the LULUCF sector. And like Dr. Geden also mentioned, and what was discussed earlier in this webinar, is that the fact that the IPCC guidelines does not mention explicitly direct air capture. So it's not clear if it should be reported or under which sector it will be reported, if it would be reported. However, the IPCC rules says that once the CO2 is captured and stored permanently, there should be no differentiated treatment between fossil and biogenic carbon. So in that sense, I think that it absolutely would be reasonable to report direct air capture DACs in case it takes place. Which was also mentioned related to BECCS. So basically, it is reported under the energy sector if it's captured from energy plant there, considering that reliable data is available and it's done in that sense. Then regarding like enhanced weathering or ocean-based carbon removal technologies, they are not mentioned, and I think the case is that they are not reported because there are so much uncertainties and risks related to permanency and also permanency and side effects of these kind of technologies. Then how these are taken into account under the CO2 accounting in the EU regulation, land-based measures are accounted under the LULUCF regulation, given the rules applied there. I don't go into the details of that, but they are accounted there. Then interesting thing is that how direct air capture or BECCS is accounted under the EU regulation. And according to my current understanding, they will basically be taken into account under the effort sharing decision in case they are reported in the greenhouse gas inventories. And why is it so? Is because the effort sharing greenhouse gas balance is calculated so that first the emissions reported to the ETS directive, in which such negative emissions are not reported, they are deducted from the overall total inventory emissions in which such negative emissions are reported, for example, under the energy sector. So in that sense, they would be indirectly transferred to the effort sharing balance. Then for the CDR technologies, there is no any link from the Renewable Energy Directive, and the CCS Directive, like I mentioned, basically sets rules for safe storage. Next slide, please. So here is a similar table, but here we can see carbon capture and use technologies and how they are reported and accounted. And in this case, as we take carbon, we capture carbon and we release carbon to the atmosphere. So basically there is a kind of zero balance of emissions. But the point is here that the emissions must be reported somewhere. So we capture carbon and then we emit the carbon somewhere, and basically it will be reported under energy sector or industrial process and product use sector. And according to IPCC rules, it's not deducted in case the carbon dioxide is released to the atmosphere. So it will be reported under that sector where the capture takes place, basically. And then regarding accounting under the EU regulation, such emissions will be accounted under the sector and the regulation which considers that sector, whether being it effort sharing sector or ETS sector. So they will be covered there. Considering that we will use CCU for direct air capture, it's hard to understand where it would be reported or accounted, because such emissions does not basically occur anywhere. So from that sense, it would not be reported or accounted anywhere. Renewable Energy Directive allows production of liquid and gaseous transportation biofuels from non-biological origin. So in that sense, it creates an incentive for such CO2 capture CCU products, given that those products fulfills the sustainability criteria set in the directive. Next one, please. So here are the conclusions regarding this greenhouse gas, the CO2 reporting and accounting rules. So the basic idea is really that the CO2 captured must be stored permanently, and there must be reliable data available in order to take that into account in the greenhouse gas reporting. So no default factors can be applied there, and there must be proof that this really happens, and the amount of CO2 which is really permanently stored. So then it can be taken into account. And CO2 transfers for use or temporary carbon storage in CO2 products is not considered by default according to the IPCC rules. I'm not talking about the harvested wood products here, which is a different case, and it's reported under the LULUCF sector. But considering that we capture CO2 and then produce certain types of products, and whether they are long living or short living, but if they are not permanent, then such CO2 is not deducted from the balances. Of course, these rules could be changed. So if there is a good reason to do it differently, so in case countries really start to produce such long-living CCU products, these rules can be changed, and such things certainly could be taken into account, considering that there are reliable data available. So the basic idea is that IPCC rules are only changed if there is a good reason to do that. Improved and reliable data is available. Then, like I mentioned, this effort sharing thing is something which really or these BECS and DACs basically could be taken into account under the effort sharing decision, which then in that case it creates an incentive for national economies to apply such technologies. But naturally, it's not an incentive for economic operators yet. So it's then about how the national policies are implemented in order to address those effects to the national policies. And then the next slide, very quickly, I only say that as a next steps to complete this project, what we are going to look here is the new proposals by the European Commission, the new legislative proposals, and also we consider in more details that what kind of changes in the legislations would be needed in order to promote appropriately CCUS solutions, what kind of challenges we face there, how can we overcome them, things like that. And we have the special focus on Finnish conditions here. And now I let Oras to continue with the international benchmarking. Thank you from my side.
Thank you, Sampo. And benchmarking region, we looked at 8 countries that we identified as particularly interesting and relevant, at least for Finland. And we found that all of these countries do have a range of policies already in place, and some of them have been very recently introduced. There is also a lot of activity going on right now. So this is indeed a very rapidly evolving field. There are significant differences between these countries and also within these countries. In the case of federal systems, you might have quite forward-looking states, and then you might have some that are not so actively involved. All of the EU countries we looked at in this benchmarking did have national policies that went quite far beyond EU-level measures. So there clearly has been an interest to introduce national policies to complement the union-wide measures so far. And at least for us in Finland, what is probably interesting is that all of these 8 countries that were covered in this benchmarking do have policies and measures that are more advanced or more ambitious than the ones currently we have in Finland. So there is possibility to learn from these examples. Now, looking at different types of policies and measures, there is a basic regulation in place in all of these 8 countries or in process of being developed, as in the case of Japan. All of these countries also have climate and energy strategies that address different carbon dioxide use and removal solutions. Some have dedicated strategies, most often on CCUS. All of these countries also provide funding for relevant solutions. In terms of the scale and scope of the funding, there is quite a lot of divergence between the countries. Some provide quite significant amounts of funding, using the case of Norway and the project that Heidi already mentioned in her presentation. Some countries focus more on the R&D and I side of these solutions, some more on the deployment side. And then quite interestingly, there is an even split when it comes to introducing different pricing incentives. And here we have included both taxes, emissions trading schemes, and auctions that specifically address these solutions. So obviously, as we all know, the EU has a general emissions trading scheme that covers part of these emissions already, but in 4 of these 8 countries, they have specifically targeted pricing incentives that aim to promote the deployment of these solutions. And using just one concrete example, in Sweden, the government has decided to introduce a reverse auction for BECCS specifically. Now, the Padlet questions I have mentioned a couple of times. There are also 2 that are directly related to policies. And if you do have some strong opinions about these questions, do use the opportunity and share your views on Padlet, and we will take use of that. But here I would just end this stream of presentations. And thank you for your patience, because it has been a lot to take in. Now is really the time to come to your questions, and I've noted that there are many. So let's try to address as many as we possibly can in the limited time that we have. I should probably start with a question from Juho Korteniemi, for the simple reason that he is the chair of our steering group, and I think I would not be invited to any other webinars if I did not try to answer this one. So Juha is asking about the interlinkages between the Fit for 55 package, such as the emissions trading scheme and the Renewable Energy Directive, and the coming certification proposal. I think this is probably something that Mr. Holzleitner might want to address. We are talking about a wide ecosystem of regulation in the EU, and surely there are many interlinkages. Mr. Holzleitner, would you like to react to that? I don't see Mr. Holzleitner currently, so why don't we come back to that? Oh, there he is. Yes, so the interlinkages.
So could you? I had some connection problems. If you could repeat the question.
There was a question about the coming certification proposal that you mentioned in your presentation, and the interlinkages between other parts of EU climate and energy policies, more specifically the Fit for 55 package, the emissions trading scheme, the Renewable Energy Directive. Yeah. Surely these are very interlinked, but can you talk a bit about those interlinkages?
Well, they are not interlinked. Carbon removals will contribute to our 2030 targets only with 225 million tons from the LULUCF sector. So that was a very clear agreement between the co-legislators when they did the climate law. So what we are doing right now on carbon removals is getting started. So to understand the monitoring, reporting, verification, how can we incentivize their financing by private funds, by public funds, and how can we understand better how they work. But the integration into any of our compliance instruments will only be for the post-2030 period, because as you've seen, there are still like policymakers still have a lot of doubts about the role of carbon removals, to which extent it could be just a cheap excuse to stop reducing emissions and so on. So there's still a lot of work ahead of us in terms of the policy discussion and which role carbon removals will play after 2030 in our compliance instruments. There's also the interlinkage with the common agricultural policy. So what will be the role of the common agricultural policy in the next one after 28 to incentivize more climate-friendly agriculture?
Perfect. Thank you very much. So it's a time frame question as well. Now that we have you there, Mr. Holzleitner, I wonder if you might want to react to Hanna-Mari Ahonen's question about double claiming between voluntary offsetting and the EU NDC, that is the nationally determined contribution. So the official obligatory targets and then the voluntary carbon offsetting markets.
Yes, so this is a question that goes far beyond the carbon removals. When you look currently at voluntary carbon markets or offsetting mechanisms, it's mostly about emission reductions. And and I think the most important application of that, when you look at Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that we need to implement also in European legislation, is CORSIA, so the offsetting of emissions for long-haul international flights. And there we need to find a way of, if an airline offsets its emissions from international flights with either in emission reductions or in carbon removal, that's done in Europe, it needs to get out of our inventories, or it needs to get out of our NDC and then into CORSIA. So that's still work we have to do, but that goes beyond carbon removals.
Thank you. If I can bring Sampo in, perhaps, of course, also Mr. Holzleitner, feel free to react. There were questions about bio-based products. Maija Pohjakallio is asking, what is considered the minimum time frame that carbon has to be stored in the product to qualify as carbon removal? And will the whole value chain be taken into account in the carbon calculation, including, for instance, transportation, or only the carbon content in the final bio-based product?
Yeah, that's a good question. Basically, what I talked about was only the carbon dioxide which is captured and then stored or used. So I was talking about that content of carbon dioxide. Naturally, when we apply these kind of technologies, they always generate certain other emissions, which then are reported in some other sectors like transportation. In the transportation sector, I think there is at least I can't answer what is the time frame which then qualifies for this kind of how long carbon should remain in products in order to be considered. But I think we can have some perspective from the harvested wood product reporting rules. So there the half-life applied is, for example, 35 years for sawn wood. So it's assumed that the carbon going to the pool at time t0, half of it is left after 35 years. So if this kind of half-life or a half-life takes place, then such a carbon pool starts to store carbon. So carbon starts to accumulate in this kind of pool. But if in case the half-life is significantly shorter, let's say 2 or few years, it doesn't matter so much. So there is no clear answer to that question, but something like decade. So the lifetime of the products must be some decades at least in order to start to accumulate carbon in this kind of new pool. But I can't answer that.
Thank you, Sampo. Is this something, Mr. Holzleitner, that the EU Commission will address in its certification proposal?
Yeah, we also want to look at carbon storage products. And I think the most interesting example, or the first one to tackle, are construction products, because there you have like carbon storage over several decades, and you can compare like woody construction materials, then also with cement or more traditional materials, particularly if you look at the end of life use. And I think what I find there quite interesting also, and where we need to work, I think in general more in climate policy, is of course the link to the product standards. So, and that's also I think a bit the question on transport costs and so on. You enter the life cycle analysis there, that you have, like for example in the construction product regulation, where also our colleagues in other director generals are very active. And this is quite a different community, where also like the scientists there are still quite skeptical about this aspect of the temporary carbon storage. So they have more the assumption, okay, whether the carbon is emitted at the beginning, like when you produce the cement or so on, or whether the carbon is emitted at the end, like when the wood products are burned. So they don't get into this, okay, that also this temporary carbon storage is something very important if you think about the tipping points and everything. So we want to keep the carbon bound as long as possible. So we need to engage with that community because of course that life cycle analysis feeds then into the product standards and are an important signal for consumers on what to buy.
Thank you. There was a big question by Einar Smednis about the kind of split between nature-based solutions and then technological carbon dioxide removal solutions, basically asking if these nature-based solutions kind of tend to gravitate towards net zero in the end. So they kind of saturate at some point and stop removing more carbon and acting as sinks over a long time. They reach a certain balance. Then in the long run, does that not mean that we need to move to technological solutions and technical carbon dioxide removal solutions, and then the natural sinks cannot continue to play such a big role?
I think we need both solutions, and of course the potential of nature-based solution, in particular forestry, depends of course on the availability of land in Europe. If you just look at Europe, but of course with a lot of the industrial solutions, you also have the limiting factor of the availability of renewable energy, because a lot of those need a lot of energy to be carried out. So we have to see how that develops, and of course I think they are also very much interlinked. If you look at the example of the BECCS plant in Stockholm, first it's about growing the biomass in a sustainable way, and then about using it for energy purposes in a very sustainable way. So for me, it's really also rather looking at the whole value chain together.
Thank you. I have what is possibly a tricky one for Sampo here from Hanna-Mari Ahonen about the international nature of accounting. So if you have cross-border BECCS or cross-border ducts, which I think is going to be the case in many of these applications, where do you really account for that carbon when it's captured or stored? So let's say we have Finland capturing carbon, and then that is going to be transported to Iceland or Norway and stored there. Somebody want to go first at that?
Okay, thank you. So according to my knowledge, first of all, what is required is agreement between these two countries. So from which carbon is transferred to another country. So there must be agreements between the countries. I am not absolutely sure whether it is explicitly defined under the IPCC rules and in which country that should be reported. Perhaps it could be dealt with between the countries, that part of it is reported under the country who is capturing it, and part of it under the report who is storing it. I'm not sure. Basically, I think that it is reported under the country in which the capture takes place, but the agreements between these countries is required. That's something that we still need to consider further. I don't know.
Thank you. I wonder, Mr. Holzleitner, if you can clarify.
As I also said before, the implementation of all of these rules will still take us some time. But also first we need to get the projects going, and then we'll see how we do this transparently.
Fair enough, thank you. And Dr. Geden made earlier the point that if there is a need to revise the IPCC guidelines, that message needs to come from the states. And in this case, it could be the EU sending a message to the IPCC that there are gaps in the guidelines when looking at different carbon dioxide removal measures. Now, let's take one question, and I would direct this perhaps to Lauri because it's about the research project that we represent here. There is a question by Hannes Tuohinittu about the logistics of CCUS and the role it plays. Is that something that this project is going to address as well, because it was not so much covered in the presentations today?
Yes, that's an excellent question. The transport is a missing letter in the CCUS acronym. But yes, we are including from Finnish perspective the logistics into the overall assessment of the project for sure. And we are this is already discussed in the mid-term report somewhat.
Thank you. Let me now go back to some of the questions that were already posted earlier in the chat about policies, and there are many, so please excuse me if I fail to cover all of them. There was, for instance, a question about from Vladimir Martis about the end of waste policy for creating secondary raw materials from waste using mineralization. This goes way beyond my area of expertise, so I'm not going to add anything to that. I hope the question itself is clear. So we have end of waste policies in the EU, and now we have this new type of creating materials out of one type of waste, which is the recycled carbon. Mr. Holzleitner, do you have something to comment on that?
I'm not an expert on that particular one, but as I already said before, as with the product standards, we'll need to look into these things much more closely. And end of life, reuse, circular economy will be very important. Also, if you discuss, for example, about bioplastics, like what are the rules there, to which extent you should favor biogenic carbon for doing it, to which extent it should be from waste streams, from recycling, and so on. So I think all these questions on circularity, end of life use, and to which extent then that also life cycle analysis and so on can give the right signals, will be something where I think we need to bring in the climate policy angle much more than we did in the past.
Thank you. If I can pick one question from Esa Vakkilainen and build on that, I trust that you, Mr. Holzleitner, are a very big proponent of the policies the EU has in place, but there are also interesting developments happening outside of the EU. For instance, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US includes quite interesting components on promoting CCUS and carbon dioxide removal. Do you feel that there are elements that the EU could learn from other countries like the US in this field?
So I think that with the Innovation Fund, we have quite a powerful instrument to support CCUS projects, as I've also shown before. And I think that we also have a unique opportunity to create a carbon market in the first place around the North Sea with an open access transport and storage policy. I mean, we have the CCS directive there, which gives very clear guidance. We need to put that into practice. So with having both pipelines, shipping solutions for transport, to have several storage sites, several capture sites, and to get that going. So I think we are looking here at quite a unique opportunity that fits for Europe, and where we can have like an approach that introduces quite a lot of competition at the different parts of the value chain. And of course, we focus very much, of course, of developing something already that's ready for non-fossil carbon. And I think a lot of the incentives in the US have more to do with enhanced oil recovery, which is not something where we have a very strong policy focus.
Thank you. That's a good point. If I pick a question by Devika Vatal, and I'm going to address this to several of our speakers today, but if Mr. Holzleitner, you want to start, Devika Vatal is asking, how do we accelerate CCUS in hard to abate sectors?
I think I'll already mention the Innovation Fund, which is for us for now the key instrument, and I think the examples that I've shown before it works.
Thank you. I wonder, Heidi, if you, based on your review of the different projects going on in Europe, wanted to address this one. You have been looking at different projects in hard to abate sectors, such as certain industrial processes. If you had any views on how to accelerate CCUS in these sectors. I see also Lauri turning his video on. Is that a sign that you wanted to react as well?
Yeah, I can give my answer as well.
Go ahead, Lauri.
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is ensuring that there is operational incentive to the activity, not just the investment support. Although the investment support is crucial as well. And well, the operational incentive now comes from the emission trading scheme, which is good, as the carbon price is getting higher. But regarding the utilization technologies and value chains, then of course we need to know what sort of utilization pathways are eligible for having the benefits from avoiding the emissions in the emission trading scheme. So knowing what is meant with CO2 that is chemically bound in the product and will stay there under normal use and recycling, what will that mean in practice will of course be very crucial information for the industries when they consider to invest in CCU, at least.
Thank you. What about Heidi?
That was a good answer. I do not have anything to add to that.
Indeed, good answers. If I can just add a couple of perspectives based on the international benchmarking, there is indeed a range of different tools that is currently in use in different countries. I mentioned earlier the reverse auction that is meant for BECCS in Sweden. That tool could be possibly applied to other uses as well and other sectors. We have tax rebates, like in the US, there is this tax rebate system that creates a relatively interesting incentive for many industries to invest in CCUS solutions. And I would also highlight a bit of an outlier when it comes to policies, but Norway has actually mandated the use of CCS in its oil and gas sector. This is quite rare so far in many countries, but perhaps one day we will also start introducing mandates that actually require you to capture the carbon in order for your industry to operate in the perhaps more long-term future. We now have still a couple of more minutes, and I am really struggling with the many questions and comments here. So I'm afraid I'm neglecting some important points. Let me try to pick at least one more. There was a question by Maija Pohjakallio related to the coming EU proposal on certification of carbon removals. And she's asking if that will cover only what she calls true removals, or might it also cover avoided emissions, which has been, of course, a big debate in the voluntary offsetting market. Mr. Holzleitner, would you like to react to that?
It will be about removals.
So that was a very clear answer, and I think that will probably make the person asking the question also very happy. We are coming to the end of our time. I would perhaps just give Mr. Holzleitner, if based on these questions and the discussion so far, if you had any final thoughts you might want to leave us with, now would be a good time. You don't need to do that. Well, then I would just thank you very much, and then ask Lauri to come back once more and share a couple of points about the next steps in the project, and perhaps also how you can get involved. So Lauri, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I will share my screen. There you go. first of all, some brief thoughts about today's talks. The discussions have been very interesting, and I feel that this really highlights the the crucial role of policies for the carbon dioxide removal technologies, and also the actual level of detail that we need to address in order for carbon dioxide removals to allow them to go from a nice and good idea to actual reality. So we are really living interesting times here, and I hope that projects such as ours at the moment are able to really contribute to the advancements in the policies. The project itself will continue during the final stage, so that it focuses on the interplay between policies and the markets. So we are actually focusing all our efforts into these policy and market interlinked questions. We are looking at as a recap already mentioned during the presentations and my opening introduction, that we are looking at the future markets and most potential and promising solutions from the perspective of Finland, naturally. And regarding the policy, we look at how the policy should be developed or streamlined, and what sort of effect would changes in the policies have on the actual developments of the CDR markets. And we are looking at the policies, how they should be developed both at the national and EU level, and how the regulations or the policies could address the challenges of CDR, such as how to ensure the permanence of the carbon removals. The final results will be available in the beginning of next year, and you are all invited to the final seminar, and we hope to see and hear from as many of you there as possible. I would like to personally thank all the presenters today, especially our keynote speakers, Oliver Geden and Christian Holzleitner, for their interesting presentations, and furthermore, especially for their contributions in the discussion sessions during today's event. So thank you for my part, and I will now yield the floor back to Oras Tynkkynen for some closing words.
Thank you, Lauri. Thank you indeed to our great speakers, and thank you to all of you for joining us today and sharing your questions and comments. They have been very well received and appreciated. I would just like to remind you of the opportunity to use the Padlet to respond to the questions if they resonate with you. If you have opinions and views about the questions that are included there, perhaps Helena might share the Padlet link one more time, and that would be of great support to our project. But with that, hopefully we will see you next year in our final conference, final seminar, releasing the final report of this project. For now, thank you and goodbye. This webinar is ended.